thank you everyone for joining with us. We have Kelly Mack, who is the partner at Workbench, which is one of the renowned VCs out of New York. And I do have, as always, Sunil, who is managing this community. You already interacted with him in the past, and you will see him more coming from Sunil. So we wanted to get together and have this evening, have a quick discussion on Kelly's perspective from a VC lens, what he sees happening in cloud security space, and also like the things that we keep hearing, like a lot of the confusing terminologies and the buzzwords, like how the VCs navigate through it. And then obviously would like to get some of his thoughts regarding this Cloud Security Practitioners Council. So without further ado, I will just go and ask the question, Kelly, first to you. My first question is that you are probably getting tons of pitches every day regarding the, like the founders coming up with solutions where they're looking for funds from VCs, right? So what are you seeing and what will be like interesting or noteworthy for the fellow practitioners who are on the consumer side, right, to keep a watch on? What type of technologies you are seeing like addressing some of the cloud security challenges that you'd like to share with us if you can?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess just to start and just a little bit of background on myself and the fund super quickly is we have Workbench, as you mentioned, early stage enterprise fund, fully based here in the city, but we invest across the country. Just being based in New York and the way that we got to know each other is that we maintain a great community of Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 executives across security, data, infrastructure, et cetera. And we, as a community, learn from each other around what are the biggest pain points that are affecting the industry. I personally focus on all of our investments in infrastructure and security. And the way that we think about investing is that we focus on those large pain points, those large challenges, find startups that help address those problems, and then really play matchmaker and invest in the companies that we see resonate. So some of the things that I'm going to share with you are some of the challenges and experiences that we've been seeing from the practitioners in our network. The first thing that I wanted to share is I actually wrote a post, maybe it was like a year or two ago, and it was on the question of, is there room in the cloud security market, or is there room in the security market in general? I think if you were to, and many people have, when you plot all the security companies that have been funded or that exist over the past 10 plus years, you'll see that it's a crazy map of companies across identity, data, endpoint, et cetera. And there's so many vendors to choose from. And I know, having spoken to a lot of practitioners, that it's so hard to understand, well, what should I even be using? What are the gaps? What do all these things mean? Yeah. But taking a step back, I always try to focus on kind of like a first principles approach to security investing, which is, on one hand, security is always changing. And security is always changing because a cat and mouse game in itself is always going to be one trying to outdo the other, which makes my job, your job, everybody's job interesting. And obviously there's a lot on the line. But because of that, one way to think about security investing is always thinking about, well, what are the attacks that are happening? How are things changing? And what are the things that security practitioners should be worried about, whether it's the rise of ransomware or the ease of DDoS attacks happening due to global networks, et cetera. And so that's something that we keep in mind when security investing is, what are the latest attacks that are happening, and what are different ways that the security industry should be responding to that? The second thing that we keep in mind is, well, aside from the attacks that are happening, our own organizations are changing themselves, whether it's leveraging cloud, whether it's leveraging new application development patterns like developing microservices, et cetera. And that's another thing that security practitioners have to keep a handle on. If serverless comes out, what's the best way to secure that? If we have an explosion of APIs, what's the best way to secure that? So that's the second thing that we keep in mind is, how does infrastructure itself change? And then the third thing is also just projecting into the future to determine, with the attacks that are happening, with infrastructure changing, should security always be a bolt-on solution that you adopt some new security solution, or is infrastructure changing in a positive way to make it so that there are certain class of vulnerabilities, certain classes of attacks that you no longer have to really care about anymore, whether that's the advent of virtualization into containerization, whether that's WAFs and proxies, being able to add a lot more functionality to it. So there are those three things that are happening that we're always trying to keep in mind. And so when I think about cloud security, some of the things that I get excited about that I think will change the industry is, on one hand, cloud in itself is another computing paradigm that changes the different experience and skill set that a practitioner has. So your normal sysadmin from your on-prem days might need to learn a bit more to get accustomed to the cloud. And as all of that operations, I guess, skill set changes, one of the things that I've been hearing from our network that needs to change as well is that attacks, when they play out in the cloud, look a lot different than the attacks that might play out on an on-prem physical network. And because of that, new tooling to determine, hey, this is malicious activity, or these credentials and identity are being abused, is something that a lot of folks in our network have been talking about. Now, whether that ends up falling into CNAPP, into CASBs, or even cloud workload protection platforms, I'm not sure. And that's where I find that all the different categories makes it a little tough to determine, all right, all I want to do is be able to flag if there's malicious activity happening in my cloud environment. I don't care what acronym it falls under. This is my pain point, this is my problem, how do I solve it? I think that ideally is where the market starts moving. So taking a step back, incident response in the cloud, I think, is going to be a major pain point, and something that we're keeping an eye on. We're investors in a company called Permiso, awesome founders from FireEye, tackling this problem from all the things that they've seen from their Mandiant days. The last two things that I'd mention is on the second point that I'd mentioned around the way that infrastructure itself is changing and development paradigms. I believe that security truly is shifting left, in the sense that security responsibilities are being added to the responsibilities and responsibilities of developers and ops people outside of security. So we're seeing a lot of great tooling designed for developers to do static and dynamic analysis themselves, for other operational tools, whether it's things like Datadog and observability tools, to provide that same level of detail for site reliability engineering folks as well as security analysts. And then the last point that I wanted to make is around, as infrastructure itself changes and there's a whole class of problems that you don't need to care about necessarily the same anymore. One problem that's come to the fore that people need to care about even more so is actually identity, just given that identity underpins everything from obviously employees getting access to the tools that they use every day, to developers as they want to get direct access to production, but you don't want to slow them down, to services as you're building more and more microservices to power an application, and they need a certain level of communication between them and making sure that it's within the guardrails that you set. So identity, I believe, going forward is going to play a huge role.
Thank you very much for sharing your perspective, and can't agree more. Like that, incident management in cloud, this is definitely something very interesting and challenging, and it's a lot different than what we used to do in on-prem, right, with our SOC, and also like so many NDR, XDR, MDR, and coming up. There is a lot of managed service, but how to leverage that service as well as intelligent tool and have an ecosystem which caters to the changing need of cloud, because more and more services are being introduced. Developers want to use those services to make their life easier. So protecting as well as monitoring from a SOC perspective. So that's awesome. And also I love your the two other points you made, like data and identity. I think these two are so critical, no matter how many left side controls or in the middle or in the right side controls you are implementing. At the end, if you can tie this puzzle, if you want to solve this puzzle and tie this thing together, right, data and identity with the activity happening in the background, then you can basically filter it out what is bad and what is good. And probably this is a great deal of protection that we need to think through. So my next question, Kelly, to you is that if I am, for example, if I'm thinking about coming up with a startup, my first goal is to come up first of all, identify a target area where I can have a sizable chunk that I can address or manage. I mean, I don't want to deal with the whole world's problem, right? I pick up a small problem area, then I build that product, and eventually my goal is to, raise fund and eventually some sort of an exit, either through, selling it up to the bigger companies and adding to the portfolio, or exit through IPO, right, in the public market. Now, if I look, or if I am a startup company, I will try to solve a smaller problem. But in cloud area, as you talked about, like posture management, security management, shift left integration, eventually there are so many smaller solutions exist. What is missing is an end-to-end integration, building some integration. Are you seeing any company in the startup community coming up by solving that problem that, yes, we are the integrators, we stitch APIs together to bring better return on your investment and provide a better solution for end-to-end? Any company solving the entire spectrum, or still you are seeing like addressing a particular area only?
So I think there are a couple of ways to look at it. So on one end, if you consider the cybersecurity portfolio, a lot of cybersecurity tools in themselves are being delivered by the cloud. So an example is like Zscaler, right? You no longer are running proxies yourself. The proxy is in the cloud, or CrowdStrike, that a lot of that data is being sent directly to the cloud, so you don't have to manage it on-prem. So I think on one hand, most security, you can run an entire security portfolio that is entirely cloud-based. And there are tools, and we invested in a tool called Cmetrics that is focused on basically collecting all of that data across all of your security tools and rationalizing and understanding how is it all performing amongst each other, where are there possible overlaps with product capabilities to, let's say, product gaps in ways in which you might, have a blind spot to ransomware protection in email, or ransomware protection for endpoint. So on one hand, if it's cloud delivered tools and the idea of cybersecurity portfolio management, I think companies like Cmetrics are providing that layer for it. When it comes to infrastructure security in itself, as you mentioned, AWS itself has CloudWatch, CloudTrail, and then a host of other tooling within the AWS suite that it has through acquisitions like Squirrel and a bunch of others. Then when you move outside of AWS, you then have tools like Wiz, then you have tools like Orca, and then you have tools like Twistlock and a bunch of others that focus specifically for containers, et cetera. And right now, it seems that the market is somewhat saturated into all those different categories that you had mentioned, C plus whatever letter combination you want to put after that.
Okay.
But I do believe that we are on the cusp of needing a solution that can unify across it. As you mentioned, when you're a startup, you do need focus. You need to focus on one specific problem and grow from there. That is, in my opinion, why we have such a fragmented ecosystem. Everybody wants to win the cloud security space, so everybody needs their edge in order to do that. But I do believe going forward, it doesn't make sense for a practitioner to adopt all of those tools. Instead, you want to adopt a tool that, let's say, helps you accomplish 80% of what you need, with that other 20% with your risk and willingness to say, partnering with a company that you believe will build this into their platform over time. That is to say, on one hand, legacy providers, portfolio approaches from people like Palo Alto Networks and Prisma actually does tend to get a good amount of, I'd say, people are pleased with it within the ecosystem. I'm not sure if you are. I don't know if you're a customer. I'm not sure if you are, but
we use Palo Alto, yeah.
I've heard, good things, and yeah, there are more than likely gaps in what they provide, but it's not a gap that you're willing to spend even more money into something that you need to then educate your own security analysts and practitioners to get on ramped for that company to just be acquired, next year. And then you're like, oh, well, there that goes. But yeah, I think that there's going to be a huge consolidation within the market. Some of the larger players are building the functionality either in-house, but given market conditions right now, I wouldn't be surprised if that consolidation comes sooner. So yeah, we'll see.
Right. No, I mean, like, very well said, and great points. So, Sunil, do you have any question? I have like one last question. I don't want to hold Kelly, like we are pretty much top of our hour. Any question for Kelly?
Yeah, I think, Kelly has certainly shared some wonderful and interesting insight. I want to ask, and especially Kelly, you mentioned in earlier, earlier response that cloud service provider itself, they are bringing number of functionalities, security services, part of their platform. How do you see that impacting these startups and other tools which are available in the market, and especially with a fragmented approach, right? The silos are there. How do you see that, the investment decision making changing according to that?
I actually think that the security industry will start to unbundle a lot more. And the reason why I say that is in the past, it was hard to get the primitives that you might have today with like AWS to get the logging, to get the data storage like you might with a data warehouse like Snowflake, and then a bunch of other tools and techniques. So it made sense for you to buy Palo Alto Networks for their firewall with everything baked in for the next gen firewall. And it made sense for you to buy a data security tool from Symantec, McAfee, et cetera. But in today's environment, if Amazon has Macie, plus there are a bunch of like serverless aspects, plus you can house data in Snowflake and then run queries on top of it utilizing something like Cloud Query or a tool like Panther. In my opinion, the need for a security solution is being unbundled. And so that security practitioners themselves, whether you look at Airbnb, Lyft, and a bunch of others, they create the tools for themselves. And now that those primitives are being, more available to the broader subset of companies out there, the Humanas, the JP Morgans, the larger companies of the world don't need to rely on a security provider, but can start to build some of that functionality themselves. So that's something that I've been seeing within the market where, it's not necessarily about some next gen security platform. It's more about, well, what's the best way for us to create any sort of analytics platform and be able to take the skill set expertise that you have as a team and create the rule set, create all of the, querying capabilities yourself. And then ideally also not have to pay the exorbitant amount of fees that you might have to for Splunk or for really any other security tool.
Yeah, and those organizations need custom, to meet their own business objectives and security needs. Yeah, absolutely.
So one last question. So thank you, Kelly, for your time. So we started this council, right? Cloud Security Practitioners Council, where we are trying to come up with of the guidelines, for example, be it a reference architecture or like what are the security requirements that I should be looking at. For example, I give you an example, like PAM, privileged access management. Whenever somebody looks into it, people go into, okay, is it a CyberArk? Is it something else? But they try to look into what features are available in that vendor solution, as opposed to looking into what should be their requirement and how they can do a risk-based analysis of which features they really need as opposed to what is being provided. So we are trying to come up with some sort of a guideline regarding if you're trying to address this space, these are the bare minimum requirement you should be looking at for your basic maturity. Then you need to add something else for your intermediate maturity, and this is the value you will get. And then look into something else for advanced maturity, and this will be your target state value. So that's the goal, right? That we came up with. We'll come up with some vendor neutral guideline driven by security and data. Now, how do you think that kind of a forum can help even the vendor to enrich their feature set, or even from a VC perspective? What I'm trying to understand is that, do you think like coming up with this sort of an artifacts and white paper will help eventually the vendor community and VC world as well? Because eventually you fund, and that's how any product grows up, right? And eventually they build a solution for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all the work that you're doing is going to be hugely beneficial for the vendor and the VC community. The thing about building a company is that you don't really do it in a vacuum. You shouldn't build a solution and then look for the problem just because you think it's cool tech. You should have it always grounded in some pragmatic experience. So that's why our own founders, a lot of the ones that we back, actually come from being security leaders themselves, come from being site reliability engineering leaders themselves, because they know pragmatically when it comes to an environment, there's legacy technologies, there's the idea of ROI, there are a bunch of different features, and you can't just throw money at the problem and buy every tool under the sun. So I think for cloud security in particular, given it is, even though it's been, 10 plus years of cloud, and even though, people talk about it a lot, it is still a nascent category with a lot of unknowns for practitioners. And it doesn't help that vendors come out with all these different terminology and different ways of saying things. So having a standard language, having a standard maturity model, having a standard way of understanding, what do gaps look like? I think would be huge within the ecosystem, and would really push building companies, building features, innovating in this space in the right direction, so that we're, everybody can be working together.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kelly. I know we are at the top of the hour, 6 o'clock. We promised that we will end it up at 6 o'clock. So thank you for your time. We will be connected, and every time we publish an article, we'll definitely share, and would love to get some feedback. And again, I feel like it is a mutually beneficial relationship. As a practitioners, if we can define our requirements clearly, then the founders and the vendors can build exactly what we need. And from a VC's perspective, having a visibility into the requirements of the customers help you investing into the right direction. So overall, I hope it should be meaningful and helpful for the security community, and looking forward to our continued partnership. So thank you very much for your time.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.